Hello everybody and welcome to the first mini-series of Code to Freak. This is what I intend to do between seasons and whenever the occasion seems good. So this one is about getting C++ up and running if you want to write your applications or you want to write Maya plugins. Now, a couple of things that I think is worth introducing this with. This is meant for people that want to learn C++, that can already do a little bit of programming. Usually, if you've already dipped your toes in the programming waters of Maya, you probably will have done it with Python, maybe Mel, though that's very long in the tooth at this point. And this is going to be Windows specific. Now, I think that I probably have to explain that, and basically there's three options you have when you want to learn to write software, be it plugins or its own standalone thing for a personal computer, and that's Apple, Linux, or Windows. Now, I don't have Mac, so even if I wanted to, I couldn't cover that platform. Linux is usually pretty involved, and we'll get into why I actually recommend that people that are absolute beginners start with Windows. And Windows, beside being the overwhelmingly most common platform that everybody, or practically everybody that has a PC has access to, also happens to have Visual Studio running on it. And love it or hate it, Visual Studio does have one advantage, which is yes, the text editing is poor, but as an IDE it has one of the best integrations around between all the various parts of an IDE. So the hints that you get into text editor combined with the debugger, combined with driving the compiler options, setting up the project and all of that. And you can argue that all of those things taken individually are not the best in the industry, and I would agree actually. But as far as integrating all of those steps, it is by far one of the friendliest to use. And that leads me to my next point, which is I find that a lot of people try and learn C++ and almost immediately basically bump into this stumbling block of the entry fee, having to set up the build, having to understand what is going on, receiving cryptic messages that they can't figure out. So even if you look up some article on how to set up Visual Studio for Maya and you manage to compile your first plugin or somebody else's plugin, some example, by some miracle, then you're normally lost from there. So in Code to Freak style, this is going to be not so much about just getting Visual Studio, compiling C++ for you so that you can get a plugin running, or compiling a simple XS so that you can start learning OpenGL. It is going to be about learning the various bits that make what's called a native application or a native plugin running, and what you need to know and all of that. Now, without further ado, I think that it's good to start from a shopping list. And now, if you want to get into Maya plugin development, there's a little bit more than just the IDE that you will need. If you go on codetofreak.com, in resources third party, I have some links. Depending on when you will be watching this video, this might be like awfully out of date. It might, not be valid any longer. Or if you watch it reasonably close to the release date, it might actually be current. Now, this is for 2017. 2018 is out. 2019 is probably not too far away, but they are mostly the same thing. You will need to get different versions of several things, but that's just about it. And procuring yourself what you need when you're not in that safe haven that is Python, that comes with pretty much everything running for you already on Maya, is part of the entry fee that you kind of need to learn how to pay. And that's what we want to make a little bit easier. Now, and in here you'll see that to get something running for Maya, well, obviously you'll need the documentation. And the reason why I list it is it's separate now from the application itself, as far as I know, or at the very least, you want to download it and stash it away, and I'll say more about that in a minute. There is the dev kit, which, depending on what you're developing, at least for Maya, consists mostly of examples, but might include something like the modified Qt sources, depending on what version of Maya you're using. And you will need node ID blocks for when you want to develop nodes. Now, I don't think I need to say more about that. What you need to read is pretty much in here on the page. But why am I mentioning this? Now, that is part of the shopping list. That is something that as you evolve through your learning and your knowledge of C++ and writing plugins and all of that, you need to get used to squirrel away these things that you download and create yourself development snapshots. Because as the environments, as the compilers, the IDEs, Maya itself, whatever libraries you use advance over the years, they can become incompatible with each other. These alignments between these moving parts that you often need to be, well aligned will go out of whack. So it might become harder to get hold of older stuff. So whenever you install Maya, make yourself copies of the dev kit, the documentation, of the headers of the libraries, and we'll get into what all of those are throughout the series, and get yourself snapshots for each version that you want to deploy a plugin for. Now, if you want to deploy standalone applications, that tends to be a lot easier. Maya 2015 and before, pretty much everything came together with the installation as of 2016. I don't remember if it was 2016.5 or 2016. They started separating the dev kit. So when you go in the dev kit, you'll find the text file that says, hey, if you want it now, you got to go on the shop. 2017, 2018, definitely the case. To obtain it, I have the links here. You can search them on Google. You'll find them here. The comments alone are hilarious and well worth looking at the App Store for. These are, for the most part, the Qt items that you might need if you start developing Qt applications in C++ that need to talk to Maya, and the examples. The libraries that you need normally should come with the Maya installation, and I do recommend that you back them up so that you can compile plugins that work on multiple versions. Or rather, you can compile a plugin for each version that you want to support. 2018, same deal. Documentation, who knows, but you can Google for those and it's pretty easy to obtain them. All right, so let's get to the shopping list proper. We're just gonna briefly list what you need and how to obtain those things, although we've already said that partly for Maya itself, and then in the following videos we will actually go into the details. So you want an ID for sure. Let me recenter my tablet. No doubt about it, if you're developing just an application like a standalone XE, you're pretty much good there. You might want some libraries maybe if you find that you need those functionalities, but that's it. If you want to develop plugins for something, obviously you will need the app itself, be it Blender or Maya or Modder, whatever it is that you're developing for. Most of them will come bundled or will allow you to obtain through separate means a dev kit and the documentation. Now, as I said, Docker and dev kit are pretty straightforward. Remember that what will happen is that over the versions, these things will change and you want to be able to keep hold of those. So, and if the documentation you think, oh, it just, changes and in a cruise and all of that, it is sometimes true. It is mostly true, in fact. But things change between versions. Something might get deprecated. So if you have to support multiple versions, I suggest that you hold on to multiple versions of the documentation as well. So that if you need to go back to things, so you've added something to your plugin, it doesn't work with Maya 2015 any longer because you were reading documentation for 2018. You can open the documentation for the previous versions and figure out if that thing you added uses some method that wasn't there before. Now, the application itself should be fairly obvious. I mean, that's going to be Maya or Mod or Blender or whatever it is that you're running. Now, your license might run out. For many reasons, you might not be able to execute the application itself. But I still suggest that you actually, especially nowadays with applications as services and not as software anymore, I still suggest that you hold onto the installations. And the reason for that is that if you look at something like Maya 2015, the dev kit was still there. If you were to do the same for 2016, you would just find the you will just find the text file pointing you to the App Store. But more importantly, the installation is usually where something like the libs will actually exist. And we'll get into what these mean and what they represent, but OpenMyLib, OpenMyAnime, and so on. These are things you link against for that plugin to compile for that version. So you need to keep them around if you want to be able to keep building for older versions, whether you have the license to run that version or not. The same goes for the headers and so on. So keep snapshots of all this stuff. Keep snapshots of the contents of all versions of that software that you intend to support or test against. And finally, we get to the IDE. Now, what do I recommend? This is pretty much the entirety of why I recommend beginners start on Windows. You can find many faults with Visual Studio, but the thing is that it does pretty much everything that you need it to do without you having to fish for 5 different separate parts and getting them to talk to each other. So, what do you need from Visual Studio? Now, if you go on visualstudio.com/downloads, you can find the various versions. At the time of recording, and this might change in the future, you will find that Community 2017 is the free one. It has everything that the professional and enterprise versions have. The exceptions are very, very minor. They're definitely not things that you will use as you're learning, and those versions are geared towards teamwork and enterprise work and so on. So you don't need any of that to learn C++. All you need is Visual Studio Community 2017. Now, Visual Studio Code is not an IDE, it's a text editor, and it's arguably, if you ask a lot of people, a much better text editor than the text editor that comes embedded in Visual Studio Community, which is a bit weird. Feel free to grab it and use it. At the same time, I will recommend that you still learn to be moderately comfortable or not too uncomfortable inside the Visual Studio text editor itself, because when you're debugging, some of the hints and features of being able to edit live inside Visual Studio are very, very convenient. And despite the fact that for some reason these ways of operating are often portrayed as advanced, like being able to debug and watch and listen and all these services, I would argue that a beginner is probably the person that is going to benefit the most from learning the tools of the trade, because more than anybody, you will have trouble debugging code and figuring out what is going on. We're going to cover that, don't worry. So this is what you want to download. Now, last part of this video will be installing it, and that's going to be pretty easy. It's part of the shopping list as far as I'm concerned, and this is where we're going to close it. Now, once you download it, it will be one of those web installers. It's the one you're seeing here. Text might be a bit tiny because I'm recording at 1440p, but you don't really need to read the fine details, don't worry. So when you launch that installer, this is what you get, the Visual Studio installer. You will see install, same as I have here for Visual Studio Enterprise and Professional. You will also see install here for Visual Studio Community. In my case, because it's already installed, it's modify. And once you select it, you will be prompted with an abundance of choices. And this is one of the things that often confuses people. You can install everything. In the past, like if you botched an installation, you were in dire straits, updating was troublesome and so on. These days it's not perfect, but it's much better than it used to be. So normally, don't worry, don't overdo the install. Install just what you need. It's pretty easy to extend it later on. All you need to get standalone applications or Maya plugins running is pretty much the desktop development with C++ part of it, which is one of the top 3 choices. Now, future versions of Visual Studio might change this installer, but generally speaking, something like this will be available. It might be called desktop development. You might find it called native development, and sort of like just exposed to native development, you will find managed things such as .NET, universal Windows platforms, various other, in case you watch these and the installer has changed considerably. Desktop development / native development is what you want to do. Everything else, you know, ignore it. And you might be tempted to say, oh, maybe one day I want to do game development or mobile development. Leave that for when you will want to do it. Don't install too much crap. Now, once you select it, what you get is another bunch of options here, and this is definitely going to read very tiny. My apologies for that, but this is just the way it works with these web installers. I can't scale it up. So all you want here is just-in-time debugger, super useful. It should be the first option. VC 2017 version 15.7. This is often a source of confusion. Visual Studio is the IDE. Visual C++ is the integration in the IDE. But VC, Visual C, is also the compiler, which is going to be versioned differently then you will see Visual Studio version. So Visual Studio 2017, when you use C++, compiles with 15.7. I don't believe that at this time this is particularly useful, but in the future, if there's ABI breakages, that might be important. C++ profiling, very useful. Windows SDK, you will probably need. Visual C++ tools for CMake. Now, we're going to go over what an IDE is and does and what it provides. Because so many projects out there are done with CMake, and these days Visual Studio has a decent enough support for CMake, it's probably worth installing it. ATL, probably not. Test adapter for Boost and test adapter for Google Test. I have those things for my own reasons. You don't really need them. It's unlikely, especially if you develop Maya plugins. It's very unlikely that you're gonna build a test suits environment. Something that I would recommend that is not part of the custom installation. The rest you can pretty much all ignore. ATL also you can ignore, but bottom here, whether you can see it or not, you will see VC++ 2015.3 version 14. Now that might come in handy if you want to develop for older than 2017 versions for Maya. I've tested it pretty extensively. Maya 2017 and 18 are just fine with VC 15. Now back with Maya 2016 and Maya 2015, I'm tempted to say I used it as well. Visual Studio was up to version 2013, and that's what they recommended. And that was using VC 11 to VC 13. So to support 16, in case you find that you have something that compiles and runs fine for 17 and 18, but it has some weird ABI issues, and we'll get into what that means, then you might want to compile it with the actual toolchain that is VC 14. So that's worth installing. You don't really need anything else. You'll start the install. It will take a while to download and configure everything, but then you should be good to go. All right, so that is your shopping list. Hopefully that gets you everything you need, and you will be able to install it. And we can now move on into looking at what an IDE actually is and what it does for you and why you should care.